Charles, thank you for agreeing to do this interview today in the Room of Propaganda. I guess we wanted you to talk to us from your role as director of the museum, specifically. Maybe you could even call that propagandist in chief. But really, why were you interested in inviting Tanja Bruguera to think about a Museum of Arte Útil? And is it something that you think might influence the running or the capacity of the museum?
Yeah, I mean, to go back to the history of the project at the beginning, I had a discussion with Tanja where we talked about making a project in the museum. And that was actually very open at the beginning. And then Arte Útil quickly became the subject of that project. I think partly because we as a museum were also thinking about our status. So clearly this question of what the museum is in the 21st century is a question that is dear to us and also interesting enough for Tanja to want to develop. So out of that suggestion, out of that proposal, the whole possibility of Arte Útil came into being. And if you say for me what is the challenge that this project represents, then I would say it's fundamentally how we can become an institution that is contemporary with our own time. Museums are essentially late 18th, early 19th century creations. They were reinvented in the 20th century around the white cube, and we need a new reinvention. I don't think we're there yet. Unfortunately, I wish we were further. But I think that Arte Útil proposes something which is a huge challenge, of course, to the 20th century order, and particularly the order of modernism and modernity, its associated ideology. So that challenge is what this exhibition represents.
But the other thing a museum does, or used to do, one could say, is it makes or produces art history. And now, in effect, we're attempting, through gathering all of this archive of over 30 or 40 years of art practices that we think are art utile, we're branding a new movement. Is that an interesting sort of process?
Yeah, the museum as an institution has a fraught relationship with history, I think. On the one hand, if you think of the museum being at a certain point in history, it's always looking back and looking forward at the same time. And looking back, it to some extent represents a collective memory, like it's the things that a society chooses to keep and to preserve for the future, so to pass on to other generations, but also to remember because they think it might be useful at a time to come. And in that sense, it's a history-telling institution. Yeah? It tells a certain history, which means it excludes lots of things and puts certain things into the foreground. It gives priority to certain objects, but also to certain social groups, to certain positions which artists might have taken in the past, and it rejects others. So it tells history. Yeah? It tells the past from the point of view of today. But on the other hand, it's also struggling with the idea of making history for the future. So at the same time as looking back and trying to order that past so that it makes sense for us today, it's also saying, what does this imply for where we go now? So for instance, for Arte Útil is a challenge to where we are now because it proposes a model of art that in a sense was eliminated, certainly from Western consciousness, by the Cold War and by the real existing communism. Which had instrumentalized art, or at least that was how it was seen from a Western point of view. So the idea is how do we reintegrate, in a sense, those two movements, the one instrumentalization of art through communism and the idea of freedom of art through freedom being a very loaded word, freedom of art under capitalism. And that reintegration is, I think, going on at this moment. And Arte Útil seems to me to propose something which is very intimately related to that integration of these two positions. And obviously it's no coincidence that Tanja comes from, in a sense, both positions, being both brought up as a communist and living in capitalism.
One of the developments in the making of this show, with the kind of really elaborate team we have of Tanja, researchers based here in the Vanabbemuseum, and the group Construct Lab, is that the museum itself has to change. It needs to become what's proposed a social power plant. And this social power plant uses the fuel and the information of all of these artist practices to affect change. It also suggests a kind of permeability that what's going on inside the walls of the museum might reflect on what's outside. Does this chime with sort of ideas that you've been developing for the mission and vision of the museum around notions of dispersal or engagement with contemporary life?
Yeah, there's a metaphor that we're using for the exhibition which is called the social power plant, and I think this is an amazingly strong metaphor actually, because if you think about a power plant, it's a kind of anonymous building in the city, but actually it drives the internet for one thing, if not many other things, industry. So clearly the idea of our dependency on this power plant at the same time as our lack of recognition of it is something which is maybe quite similar to the role that art plays within society. On the one hand, it's not recognized as being significant, it's just art. How many times do you hear that? You know, it doesn't really matter. On the other hand, if you measure historic civilizations, ancient civilizations, it's their artistic statements which are the things that survive. It's not really their economies, it's not really their industries, but it's their artistic statements which are the things that give us access. So therefore this idea of the power plant, of the museum as a power plant, is something that I find very appealing, also generally. Like, we need it, we don't necessarily have to recognize it. It's not that people have to come into the museum in order to make use of it. It's also that the museum can go outside, can influence thinking, can influence ways of behavior, which probably we can never trace back to the origin of the museum, just like it's hard to trace things back to the power plant and say it all comes from there. It's a non-causal series of effects, which artistic thinking, artistic imagination creates possibilities in the world which otherwise wouldn't be there. And those possibilities, some of them, are the ones that allow the future to unfold.
When we were trying to define the terms for arte utile, we set up almost a quasi-scientific process of criteria. And one of the sort of key elements was the idea that arte utile should not just solve social problems. It should actually be creative. It should actually even perhaps be subversive. It should challenge the status quo and propose new things. Do you think this is an important role for art?
One of the things that Arte Útil, or the Museum of Arte Útil, proposes is to some extent the abolition of the museum as it currently exists. And I think that's a great challenge. I think it's a really necessary challenge, particularly at this moment of transition, which I'm trying to talk about. How we move from a modern paradigm to another paradigm. And at that moment, everything is up for grabs in a certain way. Yeah? So the existence of institutions like these can no longer be taken for granted. We know that in the political day-to-day of cuts, but we also know that, I think, in our hearts or in our minds, in terms of its sustainability under this new paradigm. And I think Museum of Arte Útil makes the challenge very clear. And you know, the hope is that it will shift a little bit in this slow-moving society. It will shift a little bit the possibilities that the museum has for the future.
A lot of people, when we talk to them about this idea of examining art as a tool, are very critical of the approach. They see it potentially as dangerous as a way of evaluating art, in that we're in a society that balances everything through cost-benefit analysis and effectiveness. Do you agree? Do you agree that we're putting art in a very vulnerable position? Or do you think that art should actually try and investigate a sort of efficacy and a usership?
If we're in a time of transition, which is what I'm trying to say, then things become vulnerable. You know, things start to break. And that's just the condition that we are in. So therefore it's important, in a sense, to present yourself as vulnerable. Because then the question of what do we want to retain of what existed under the old paradigm and what do we want to throw away becomes much more real, becomes much more tangible. Because if something is vulnerable, then it can be destroyed. And in the process of thinking about its possibility to disappear, we might know why we want it to stay. So I think that this vulnerability is very necessary. Of course there's huge danger to it. There's huge danger to an institution like this museum. We have to be clear about that. But that danger is not something that we can avoid by putting our heads in the sand. The moment that it becomes normalized within a neoliberal society is really the moment of danger for art, because that's the moment it stops, as far as I'm concerned, being art and becomes design and decoration.
When we were discussing the idea of the show and a lot of our curatorial and research discussions, you said at one point, I don't want us only to show art utile that is homeopathic. Could you talk a little bit about that idea of things that are only homeopathic or problem solving, and why it was important to show another alternative?
I think Arte Útil provides an interesting, in a sense, opposition to relational aesthetics or to some of the other movements that happened in the 90s within the art field. And these movements, I felt, were much more, or have been much more homeopathic. And what I mean by that is that they provide perhaps a false cure, perhaps a cure which is a very tiny addition of something like a homeopathic medicine, something which tries to set everything right again. Whether homeopathy works or not is not the question here, but it's this idea that it sets everything right, it keeps everything in balance. And I'm not sure that retaining the balance of, if you like, the post-Second World War settlement or neoliberalism is really the task of art today. I'm not sure it ever was.